Welcome to the second lecture on environmental management approaches. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the adaptive management approach. In the last lecture, we talked about the conventional approach to environmental management, which is most suited for problems that are relatively simple and where we have pretty good scientific knowledge, or another way of saying that is there is low scientific uncertainty. Unfortunately, many of the environmental challenges we face are not as simple as the problems we outlined or the issue we outlined under the conservational approach. Let's go back to our example list of environmental challenges. The conventional approach is useful for problems like reducing air pollution and other pollution issues, because these problems often have only a few interrelated pieces or parts. Other problems like the sustainable management of marine coastal ecosystems or combating land degradation and desertification are much more challenging. These sorts of environmental challenges often involve entire ecosystems. And just by virtue of the fact that they involve the entire ecosystem, there are many interrelated components to the system. And these components can interact in complicated ways. For these more complicated types of environmental challenges, we need a different management approach. Before we get into the management of these types of ecological challenges, let's quickly talk about ecosystems. So ecosystems are communities of living organisms, plants and animals that interact with each other, and also the non-living components of the environment that create an emerging system, as it's known, that is more than just the sum of its parts. What you see on the definition of this slide from Bergen's book on ecology is essentially what we were just talking about. Ecosystems are the combination of living and non-living things that create a recognizable entity. It's key to realize that humans are also an integral part of many ecosystems because we live in these environments, we influence them dramatically. So what we can do is we can kind of distinguish between natural ecosystems that have not or have hardly been affected by humans and managed ecosystems where humans have been the major driving force. Because ecosystems have so many moving parts or so many components, the response to change is extremely complex and often it's difficult, in fact, it's almost difficult to predict reliably where that ecosystem might end up in response to this change or perturbation. We've already talked about many of these system characteristics at the beginning of the course. So we talked about ecosystems involving fluxes and feedback loops and interaction effects that can result in nonlinear responses. We talked about thresholds where systems might flip from one state to a different ecological state. There might also be a long lag between the perturbation and the response that the system shows. And some of these changes might be irreversible. For example, we might have a forest that then might flip to a desert. And that might be an irreversible flip, certainly in the kind of timescales that humans experience. There is also a challenge that the human-induced perturbations or disturbance might be way outside of what the ecosystem had to deal with naturally in the past. So the plants and animals might experience disturbances caused by humans that those plants and animals have never experienced in their history of their evolution, and so they don't have the capability to effectively deal with that change. All of this means that there is generally almost always high uncertainty about how ecosystems function and how these ecosystems might respond to different management actions. All of this is quite different from the very well-defined air pollution example that we looked at in the last video, where conventional management works. For these more complex issues, we have to talk about the idea of adaptive management. Now, having only a limited understanding of a system and having high uncertainty about how a system will respond to management actions, these are not the only challenges for addressing these bigger or more challenging environmental issues. The potentially long time lag in the response of the system is also a challenge because this time lag can potentially take a long time in order to see the effects of a particular management action. Another issue is that there are often multiple conflicting goals. Environmental protection is often at odds with economic interests or social needs of, say, local communities. Because it's necessary to make compromises and trade-offs among these objectives, there is also no obvious single right answer in many of these solutions. This is very different from the air pollution situation that we talked about in the last lecture, where reducing the pollution is in everybody's best interest. To further complicate this issue, there are often many stakeholders, and these many stakeholders often have competing interests and perspectives. Picture, for example, the contrast between environmental groups and forestry companies. Last but not least, an additional challenge is that given so much uncertainty and these long timelines, politicians and decision makers are often reluctant to act because the decision makers are worried about potential failures not looking good during the next election, which typically come up much sooner than the time required to make meaningful progress on these larger environmental issues. So, what do you do in a situation where the path forward is unclear? Waiting only makes the problem worse, but you don't have the necessary evidence to design the perfect solution. For these type of environmental challenges, adaptive management has been proposed as a useful approach for moving towards a solution in meaningful ways. Adaptive management is a structured, iterative decision-making process that explicitly acknowledges uncertainty and continuously works on improving conditions and reducing uncertainty at the same time. Adaptive management is a real key for environmental challenges, so let's take a deeper look at it. The steps in the adaptive management cycle are assessing the problem, designing a meaningful management plan that maximizes potential results and potential learning, implementing this management plan, monitoring the system continuously to test your assumptions and to see how the management plan works out, critically evaluating the monitoring results to learn more about how the system works and respond to the management plan, and finally, adapting your management plan based on what you've learned. Once you've come full circle, then you start doing it again and begin the next iteration. One of the key characteristics of adaptive management is that it incorporates research into action. This is the continuous integration of design, management, and monitoring to systematically test assumptions in order to adapt and learn. Let's look at a few other characteristics for successful adaptive management. First, it is critical to involve many stakeholders early in the process to get a good overview of the different perspectives and collaboratively design realistic management options among all the stakeholders. You then want to use all the tools that you have to develop the best possible management plan you can do given the current understanding of the system, which we've already acknowledged has a fair bit of uncertainty associated with it. Models, ecological models, and economic models and social models, all kinds of computer models, play a key role in this stage because these models enable you to look at many different options very quickly without having to actually do anything in the field. Modeling also plays a key role in choosing a management action that explicitly examines the assumptions and aspects of the system that you don't understand very well. This sets the stage for learning and improved management, and this is one of the keys that adaptive management is often known as learning by doing. So we've got this learning and improved management actions that we can then implement in the next iteration of the management plan. Active monitoring of the system also plays a key role because this monitoring enables us to ensure that we're actually going to get the insight that we were looking for. Once you've improved your understanding of the system, you can then adapt your management plan in a meaningful way for better long-term outcomes. Now, to be clear, this does not mean you try something, and if it doesn't work, you try something else. And if that doesn't work, you try something else in one place. That's called trial and error. And adaptive management is not that. Instead, you want to set up your management as an experiment where you have treatments and replicates and controls, and you let those run, and then you compare the results of multiple hypotheses. To summarize the key points at this point, adaptive management is a structured and iterative process, and it's for robust decision-making when there is quite a bit of uncertainty, which is almost the case with any ecological system that there will be uncertainty. The goal in adaptive management is to balance achieving the best short-term outcome based on our current knowledge while actively gaining knowledge to improve the management over the long term, so learning by doing. The key point here is that the experimentation adaptive management is very different, as I said, than the trial and error approach, where you just simply try things out. The research and adaptive management is targeted and well designed because that's how we learn about the uncertainties and assumptions in the system. One of the local primary examples of the use of adaptive management has been the Great Bear Rainforest. You can see on the map on the right, the Great Bear Rainforest is along the central coast and north coast of British Columbia. And the Great Bear Rainforest consists of about 6.4 million hectares of coastal temperate rainforest. Coastal temperate rainforests are globally rare, and 25% of the world's unlogged coastal temperate rainforests are in the Great Bear Rainforest. The Great Bear Rainforest is also known for its high level of biodiversity in marine life, mammals, birds, plants, and trees. Approximately 2/3 of BC's mammal species and 77% of BC's freshwater fish species live within the area of the Great Bear Rainforest. The cream-colored bear, or the white bear you see here, is the Kermode or spirit bear, which is the official provincial mammal for BC because it is only found in areas around the Great Bear Rainforest. It's a genetic variation of the black bear, and the coat color is caused by a single recessive gene, and that's what gives it the blonde coat. Approximately 18,000 people live in the Great Bear Rainforest, half of whom are First Nations from the region's 26 First Nations territories. Of course, there are also tremendous economic opportunities in the area, including forestry, mineral extraction, fisheries, and tourism. Now, in the recent past, the big forest companies were the dominant force in the region due to the incredible amount of forests in the area. As a result, they were also the main employer and supported the livelihood of the local residents. But in the late 1990s, the Heiltsuk people started to express concern about the clear-cut logging practices that was occurring in their traditional territories. Now, you can probably tell we have a diverse group of stakeholders, many of whom with actually competing interests. This made it difficult to come up with a clear objective and a meaningful management plan that was going to be supported by everybody involved. So, in 1996, the process to develop a land and resource management plan along the British Columbia coast was initiated. The process involved all of the stakeholders right from the start: First Nations, the British Columbia government, forest companies, environmental advocacy groups, just anybody who had an interest in the area. I just want to make a quick side note here about language that's a key one. That stakeholders are defined as people who have an interest in a particular area. Often it's because of commercial reasons like logging companies or recreational reasons or whatever it might be. But a key point for you to recognize and to know is that First Nations are not stakeholders. First Nations are parallel governments. They are treated and have status at the tables in the way that the BC government does. So First Nations are never stakeholders. In this particular case, around 2006, the governments of BC and the First Nations governments committed to an ecosystem-based adaptive management approach in the Great Bear Rainforest. Now, ecosystem-based management, or EBM, is a specialized, holistic approach to managing natural resources in the context of human and natural communities. Instead of just focusing on individual parts of the system, ecosystem-based management aims to manage the entire ecosystem and all its parts. The overall objective is to strengthen the health and resilience of the ecosystem so the ecosystem can be productive and sustainably support the livelihoods of the local communities indefinitely. Because after all, that's what sustainable means. It's sustainable indefinitely. Because of the complexity of the entire ecosystem and the fact that local communities and ecosystems are constantly evolving, especially during these periods of climate change, then the approach inherently needs to be adaptive. So there are ongoing research projects, and this continues to this day, in support of increasing our understanding of the ecosystem in this area and developing better management plans. Most, if not all of these research projects, are conducted in collaboration or led by local First Nation communities that have a tremendous amount of traditional knowledge tied to the land in these places and the processes that occur there. One of the key research players is the Hakai Institute, which is a privately funded research institute that conducts place-based ecological research in support of local communities on the BC coast. The Hakai Institute has research observatories on Calvert Island in this red dot, north of Vancouver Island, and on Quadra Island in the Georges Strait. If you're interested in this type of research, you should check out the website of the Hakai Institute at hakai.org. So after about 20 years of work and stakeholder consultation, working with First Nations, working with the provincial government, the BC government enacted a new Great Bear Rainforest Land Use Order and the Great Bear Rainforest Management Act in 2016. What you see on this slide are some of the highlights of this agreement that try to find the right balance between environmental protection and social and economic needs of all the stakeholders. This includes that while 70% of the existing old growth forest is protected under the agreement, 15% of all forests are available for logging. This is to ensure that there are jobs for local communities. The agreement also outlines how logging should be done so that the logging is sustainable and that the logging can support all of the communities over the long term, ideally forever. That's what sustainable means. The agreement also ensures that First Nations culture and social needs are protected and that the First Nations have a more powerful voice in what goes on in the forestry sector in this area. The photo on the right shows the representatives of the different stakeholders and government agencies when the agreement was enacted. Now, the Great Bear Rainforest Agreement focused on the terrestrial systems, but the marine ecosystem in the area is equally unique and essential for local communities. So, roughly at the same time, the BC government and 16 local First Nations also signed the Ecosystem-Based Marine Plan Partnership that defines how marine resources along the BC Pacific Coast could be used sustainably for the benefit of local communities now and into the future. The Great Bear Rainforest Agreement and the Marine Plan Protection Partnership are both landmark agreements for sustainable development in unique ecosystems that balance environmental protection with the social and economic needs of local communities. These agreements really showcase the values of the ecosystem-based adaptive management approach that combines scientific and traditional knowledge. If you're interested in learning more about these initiatives, you can find lots of interesting information about them on various websites. Before we wrap up, let's quickly contrast the conventional and adaptive management approach to highlight their differences. As we discussed at the beginning, the conventional approach is best suited for relatively simple issues, where our level of understanding of the science is quite detailed. The adaptive management approach, on the other hand, is for complex issues, where our understanding of this ecosystem and the issues and the implications of those issues is still fairly limited. There is a high degree of uncertainty. Another difference in the nature of the problems is that the likely solution space for the two differs. Relatively simple problems tackled with the conventional management approach often have a single optimal solution. It is in everybody's interest to reduce air pollution to the absolute minimum, and there's generally no controversy around this. But the situation is not so clear-cut for more complex issues that have many different stakeholders with often conflicting objectives and priorities. In these situations, there are often multiple possible solutions, and finding just the right one is a critical piece of the whole puzzle. Another difference between the two approaches is how the two approaches are implemented. In the case of conventional management, you only start once you have sufficient understanding of the system, and your objective is to solve a particular problem. Once you know the solution, your focus is on enforcing the regulation and monitoring the progress towards that particular solution. In the adaptive management approach, the goal is to start managing immediately, and you've got to do that based on the best available current understanding of the system while acknowledging all the uncertainties. And as we spoke about before, this is where ecological modeling can help, because you can model in what you know, and you can take a look through sensitivity analysis in the model about the uncertainty for things you don't know. Now, because these sorts of big ecosystems are complex, you can't wait until you know everything before you start acting. And so this is why you need to start managing immediately based on the best available understanding and using models. The objective is continuous management, and that the focus is on learning by doing. In the conventional management approach, the learning occurs primarily before you intervene, and management failures are not desirable. Management failures are undesirable, and they're not deemed to be productive. In the adaptive management approach, however, learning is an integral part of the management plan, and failures of individual aspects of that plan can still be productive because they provide key information about how the system does or does not work. In the end, the conventional approach is focused on results only, whereas the adaptive management approach is focused on results and learning. Say it with me, adaptive management is learning by doing. This brings our discussion of adaptive management approach for environmental changes to an end. In the next lecture, we will look at the third of the series on environmental management and then look at the precautionary approach. So that'll do it for this lecture. Again, I thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.